Hi, this is Sharon Davis, Erin Clanton from Kansas State University, and Lisa Fluff from Manhattan High School Family and Consumer Sciences. And we're here today because baking is a great bridge from home to careers. And we love FCCLA. We love the fact that all your career connections, your family's first, your financial fitness, we could just list them all. They all apply nearly to baking as a skill that you can learn. So for professional development today, we'd like to offer you just a small session on just one aspect of baking ingredients. Erin Clanton is with Kansas State University's Baking Science Division, and he is the national educator for baking. Lisa is the secondary level, high school level, facts and baking science teacher for Manhattan High here in Kansas. So when you have a minute, look at your whole guide on what we can achieve with baking. And I'd like to turn it over to Erin and Lisa now to do a few excerpts from Lab 3 in our Baker's Dozen manual.
Well, thank you, Sharon. One of the things that we wanted to talk through from a baking perspective is that when we're baking products, we use flour. That's our main ingredient that we use. And all flours are not necessarily created equal. When you go to the store, you see a bread flour, you see a cake flour, you see an all-purpose flour, you see a pastry flour maybe. And does it matter which flour you pick? Well, absolutely it matters. And we want to talk through some things about those flours that are different, as well as show you a few demos that you can do in your classroom to help educate students about what the difference between flour is. Now, when we talk flour in baking, predominantly we're talking about wheat-based flours. And it's important to understand that with wheat, and it's really all grains, but wheat especially, we have three main parts of the wheat kernel. And this is my rudimentary image of a kernel of a wheat.
There you go, Erin. Yeah.
So our outer part is the bran. The bran is where our fiber and all the B vitamins are. So this is the nutrition. The smaller part here is the germ. This is where all the fat for the kernel resides. This is also where we get the vitamin E as well as vitamin A. So there's also some nutrition there. But the center part of the kernel, that's what we call the endosperm. And so when the millers mill the wheat into flour for, say, like a bread flour or an all-purpose flour, they're mainly targeting getting this endosperm. So for most of the flours that we have that we purchase, if it's a white flour, that's coming from the center part. But if we get a whole wheat flour, it's got all three parts. So that's one difference that we see. Another difference that we see in our flours, as I mentioned, is whether it's whole wheat or whether it's refined. But when we get into whole wheat, another confusing thing when you go to the store is you see white whole wheat and you see red whole wheat. So what's the difference? Well, the main difference is that outer part of the wheat kernel has a different color. So on this tray, we have three different flours. This is a refined flour, so this is that main center part, the endosperm. This is a white whole wheat flour, and this is a red whole wheat flour. Hopefully you're able to see. You get a slight different coloring from the two flours. This has a little bit lighter color, this has a little darker color.
Is there much nutrient difference between the red and the white whole wheat flour?
There might be a slight protein difference, but otherwise they're very much the same. And from a baking perspective, they bake very similar.
So mostly what's missing here is the bran coat and the germ?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, you meant between this and this.
Well, no, I did. I meant between these two.
Between
Because people
those two,
will
yeah.
ask that. They'll say,
Yeah.
well, is one better than the
And,
other?
well, and it's one of those things, that's really whole wheat? Yeah, that's really whole wheat.
Yes,
So
good.
from a nutrition perspective, and I'm a whole wheat eater, so I really like to use the white whole wheat.
That's great.
So
And these are available at supermarkets, but also the professional bakers are using this widely.
Correct,
The white
correct.
whole wheats.
So what is the magic behind wheat flour? Why is it that in baking we use it? Well, in that endosperm, in that center part of the kernel, the wheat has a couple different components. It has starches and it has protein. It's really the protein and the gluten-forming proteins that we're interested in that hold and trap gas into like a batter or a dough. So one of the things I like to do to teach students and others about gluten is use my handy dandy prop. One year I was pulling these out for Christmas, and this is just how my crazy brain works, but I pulled them out and I said, ooh, that's protein. So bear with me, bear with me. I'm a crazy chemist as well as a baker. Why I like to use this as protein is made up of different amino acids. So each one of these light bulbs represent the different amino acids. And we're mixing specifically a dough. What we're doing is we're stretching and bending and stretching and bending and folding the protein. And what our goal is to make it so they get all entangled. So if my fist is a little air bubble, it makes it difficult for that to escape. So we have two components of our protein in the wheat. We have the gliadins and the glutenins.
Okay.
And when we add water or when we start to mix or knead, we bring those together and we form gluten.
And you want that stretch from the gluten,
Right.
like you're saying, to trap that air.
So the way we check gluten formation often on a dough is that we'll take and we'll do what we call the window pane. So we'll take a piece of dough and try to stretch it out. But usually we're looking to pull out and get a thin filament. This one's a little strong. So usually if I was making bread, I'd mix this dough a little bit longer because it stretched and broke. That shows to me it's a little too elastic.
So at home, when you're baking, and hopefully your students will be practicing at home because you can't teach it all in school. The bottom line is when they knead by hand, they probably can't over knead it. They will end up with a little weaker gluten window. But on a machine, when they're a professional baker, they could overmix it, and then that's part of what you end up teaching that way too.
Yeah.
So I just have to say, this loaf of bread, if you don't develop that gluten, you end up with the brick.
Right.
That's the point.
Right.
It can't raise, the yeast can't do all the work.
And it doesn't trap that air bubble.
It won't trap okay.
Because you've got to trap the air bubbles by developing the gluten, because the yeast basically releases CO2, and that fills those air bubbles. So another thing that we can do to show, and this is another great thing to show students, is that one other difference we see in flours is they all absorb water differently. So a really good demo that you can do is you can take several different flours, and we've got 5 different flours here. We've got a cake flour that's been bleached, so it's bright white. We've got an all-purpose flour. We've got a bread flour, and we've got 2 whole wheat flours. And each of these are going to have different amounts of water that they absorb when you mix it with, say, to make a dough or say a batter. So a good thing to do is to have students, I prefer to use weight. You can do volume measure, but volume measure is a lot less consistent. We prefer to do everything in weight because that gives us more consistency over time. But you have basically equal parts flour and water, and then you can see the differences.
So we have 1 ounce of flour and 1 ounce of water here by grams 28. And I've got cake flour. We've got a little grid here, teachers. You can also do this where you ask the students to think about the properties of these flours. Which one's going to be a more absorbent, Aaron? The higher protein or the lower protein?
Typically we see higher protein absorbs water more. Because we have whole wheat though, you've got the fiber in there, and the fiber will absorb more of that water as well. Now the thing with this that's challenging, it's hard for students to do as well, is you really want to try to mix them all similarly so you can have...
It's a control thing.
Yeah, so you can have a mixing not be a variable.
So you might have them count like to 60.
This one is a cake flour, and so you can see this one, it's pretty sloppy, doesn't really come together very well. The other thing with cake flour, as I said, it's bleached, so it gives us that bright white appearance. Now, there is one difference between bleached versus unbleached flour. People are really looking into unbleached. With most flours, it doesn't matter about performance, but with cake flour specifically, it does matter with performance because that changes the absorption. And you can see it's more sloppy, more like a batter. Here's the all-purpose, and you can see that this one starts to develop some of that gluten-forming proteins. Here is a bread flour that typically has more protein, and again you can see it's starting to string out, which is a good indication that you're getting some gluten forming because those gluten strands start to form together. And then this, you can see, is a much firmer mass.
Wow.
Look at that, look how it's dropping it. That's kind of fun. But that's because all that fiber is going to absorb in more of that water.
This one's sorghum flour.
Oh, this is the sorghum flour.
What can you tell us about sorghum flour? Is it a gluten-forming flour or not?
Sorghum is a non-gluten forming flour. So one of the things that we find happening right now in the industry is people are looking at gluten-free. And the challenge with gluten-free is you don't have that magic protein to help trap gas. You have to use something else. So sorghum is an ancient grain that does not contain gluten. Some of the other things that don't contain gluten are millet, amaranth, quinoa, teff. Another one, oats, technically is gluten-free, although you have to watch out because it's handled the same way, so it might be contaminated. So people do have to watch out for that. But that's definitely a challenge in the marketplace.
Sometimes we forget corn.
Corn is gluten-free, yeah.
Okay,
Rice.
one of our best. That's right, rice.
And rice.
That's good.
One more quick one that I'll talk through. We don't really have a chance to demo this one. But another one I like to do with students is to have them do, again, a certain amount of flour and a certain amount of water. In this case, I do 50 grams of flour and 25 to 30 grams of water, and we mix a dough, and then you let it soak in water, and then you, about 10, 20 minutes, and then you slowly knead it, and what happens is it washes the starch away, so you're left with the protein. And so that really gives students a chance to visualize what we mean by gluten. So here's a couple differences. So this particular one is a higher protein flour. And
So the starch is all washed away. In
this
these.
is just the protein, and you can see it's a pretty stretchy.
Yeah, it's a little stretchy.
You wanna?
Yeah, I did. Whoa.
This is an
The
all-purpose.
students will love this. It's
Yeah.
like a slime ball. or
It's a
whatever they
slime
call
ball.
it.
Some
Yeah.
students don't like it, but some love it. And then this is an all-purpose, so it's still got the stretch, but you can see
Not quite
that
as
there's
much.
not as much.
Think pizza crust and think soft crust. Anything
Yeah.
you want an extensible dough, it makes a difference.
And
Yeah.
this is that cake flour,
Oh,
or
wow.
low protein, and see how much different it is, that it's not holding together.
But that's really great for cakes.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I have
So-
to just throw in that all-purpose right here in Kansas is a high protein, typically, more
Typically.
high protein.
Typically.
But if we buy all-purpose down in Georgia, for example, or North Carolina, it might be a soft wheat, or up in Michigan, and then that would be more like a cake flour protein, correct?
Yeah.
I think Lisa's going to help us with that. And
So we talked about different types of flour. They're not all equal. So what can you do with your students in lab for them to actually produce to help with that? So I have some of the ingredients already scaled out and measured out for us. Again, weight is going to be more accurate, but volume is also part of the formula as well. With the muffin mixing method, we are going to have 2 bowls. One has all of my dry ingredients already. It has a mixture of flours, the chemical leavening, and the salt. This is going to be your liquids. I have oil. You can pick between melted butter and oil, but you have to be careful. If you melt the butter, it needs to cool down and come to room temperature. If you put hot butter with maybe the colder eggs or milk, it's going to form kind of chunks of the butter, and then it's not going to have a uniform consistency, and then you're going to mess up your results later in the muffins. So make sure all of that's room temperature. I have already whisked the flour. You want to make sure you break up the clumps, and then this is mixed together too. You're going to want a well in your dry ingredients. Keep in mind you do not have gluten in this dry ingredients already. There's proteins in the flour, but you need them hydrated in order to start forming the gluten.
so without the water, you don't get gluten
Correct.
formation, I should say.
So I am going to get all the liquids into the dry ingredients. And I start off using a whisk just because it kind of breaks it up a little bit, but you want to get most of the clumps out, and then I kind of start with the rubber spatula. You do not want to overmix this muffin batter. This is a quick bread, it's not a bread dough, so it's going to be a little bit different. If you overmix this, you're going to get more of a tough, possibly misshapen muffin. You might also see some tunneling. If you cut your muffin in half and you look at the crumb, I actually have an example of a muffin that has tunneling.
Does it have tunneling?
Because
Oh,
I
yeah, look at that
overmix those muffins. So you can kind of make it a competition in your classroom and say you don't want any of your kitchen groups to come up with tunneling. You'll be cutting their muffins in half, and then they can call each other out on it. But you want it just moistened and combined, then you can stop. It's okay to have a few lumps in there because they're going to dissolve in the heat of the baking process. From here, we have some muffin tins, and you can use liners to help protect your pans. One reason it can help prevent your muffins from getting soggy as they're baked in there, but it also protects your pan itself and makes them last longer as you're not having those oils bake onto the pan. And the students will really like it because it gives easier cleanup,
We
which is
all like
important to
that.
them. Yes, we all do.
We all like that.
Another tip for teachers, you can also have them color coordinated just to make sure they're not mixed up and you know exactly which variation is which. Some of them are going to be easier to tell visually, but it's always best to check. Then you have a number 20 scoop. My scoop actually has the number written on here, but it'll depend on the brand and what type of portion scoop you have. Consistency is key. Keep in mind that you want these even. What I like to do is kind of do a heaping scoop and then level it off with a straight edge. This will help keep your students accurate and precise in how big the muffins. You want every single muffin to be the exact same size so that you're actually looking at the correct results.
So another method might be to put the muffin cup, you have a weight of batter, and you can divide that into 6, and you know what weight each muffin needs to be. You can put the muffin cup on the scale and weigh out the batter. In the professional world, they have portioners that do that by a computer method, but
And do several at a time.
that's right. Now, what's the
Yes.
other reason we want every muffin to be the same size in that pan, Lisa?
You want, and it'll be easier for the results to show so that they're all the same size and consistency. Also, if you're doing a bake sale, you want it all consistent, and you want every muffin to bake evenly so that it's not overly browned. There's a lot of different reasons why you want that.
Some of my students would end up with them separate in size, and then you ended up with some very brown muffins and some a little bit doughy on the center. They weren't the same size in the other two.
Yes.
Yeah, it happens.
This was the control recipe. So the control is all-purpose flour, which has about 10 to 11% protein. But then these are possible different variations. In the lab manual, actually show you some examples, but you can do a variety of different methods just to show not all flour is the same. With the all-purpose, again, this is the control. Then you can do a variation with half of it all-purpose, half of it whole wheat. Whole wheat flour has all parts of the bran, germ, and endosperm part of it, so it's going to change nutrition. It also changes absorption of that water, so it might be a little bit more harder to press into, but a little bit less, I guess, tough compared to the 100% whole wheat because it has all of the parts, but it absorbs a little bit more of that moisture. Bread flour is a lot higher protein, so you have a lot more of that gluten-forming proteins. This is going to be a lot better for like a bread loaf compared to cookies and cakes, which you can actually feel a difference in pressing it. And then cake's going to be a lot more tender, which you can easily tell if you were to press your finger in here, only 7 to 8% of protein. You can also usually tell a color difference. Cake is a lot of times bleached. You can also try this with gluten-free flours. Cornmeal is a great way to insert too to make cornbread muffins, but there's lots of different variations. Keep in mind, make sure your students know this purpose of this is to tell the different types of flour. This is not going to be the world's best tasting muffin. There's not mix-ins in these, but you could easily do that if you're going more for a bake sale.
That's right. As far as other ways that students can learn about flour, is there one other hot one you'd like to throw out there that you'd like to offer for them with another recipe? And other than that, we'll close our conversation about flour here in a minute. So,
I don't know about Lisa, but I like to use cookies.
I do
Cookies,
too.
Another great vehicle for that.
and what will be the difference if you used a bread flour versus a soft wheat flour for a cookie?
You really see spread differences.
Spread difference. Okay.
And
So,
texture, when you bite into it, bread can make it a little bit more chewy.
great. So maybe a chewy, crisp, and otherwise the height of the cookie as well as the spread would show up differently. Thank you. I want you to all consider, as teachers and advisors out there, that the Kansas State University Baking Science program is very unique, and you might want to direct your students to that website. Kansas State, you want to give it, Aaron?
It's grains.ksu.edu.
grains.ksu.edu, and they can learn about milling careers as well, which there are jobs in all of them, from everything from apprenticeships and the person who loads the flour to the person who's in the research business and doing the R&D. Lisa, anything you'd like to add?
Say yes to FCS. We need a lot of students to be taught by teachers who know a lot about baking science and make connections with them.
And check out our resources at homebaking.org. Lots of free stuff, and then our lab manual will get you through the day. Thank you.